shows up, I'll kick him. Not being here. Okay, Jim, for some reason, isn't here, so I will give a 2-second intro. Jim organized this. And Matt spoke recently to the Beltsville Garden Club. It was very, very interesting with a lot of beautiful pictures and trees. And then Matt toured a bunch of us from the Beltsville Garden Club around the Asian collection at the Arboretum. And that was fascinating. So Jim got in touch with Matt, well, at the end of that, and asked if he could speak to Four Seasons. And so Matt is you're a specialist in Japanese maples, I believe?
Well, I would say yes. I'm currently the horticulturalist and curator of the Asian collection as a whole, and an ISA certified arborist. That by the nature of my job currently work with a lot of Japanese maples. So yeah, I'm very familiar with almost all of the cultivars grown in the Mid-Atlantic, and have worked on a lot of the trees and seen a lot of the cultivars that work well and some of the techniques that work best for them to really thrive here in our Mid-Atlantic zone. So thank you, Daniel. I appreciate that introduction. I am, like I said, currently the horticulturalist and curator at the Asian collection of the U.S. National Arboretum. And before that, worked in the Smithsonian Gardens for several years, and then Enid A. Haupt Garden and the Ripley Garden, and lots of fun places here in the Washington, D.C. Federal Public Garden world. So thank you for joining us tonight. We'll talk a lot about Japanese maples, and we'll talk a little bit about their history and some of the cultural meanings in their native range, and a bit about how to select now in the over 1,000 cultivars that are currently on the market. How to kind of tune in to some of those forms and textures that are specifically pleasing, and how to select those for our gardens for the next time someone wants to plant a Japanese maple. So let's get going. This is a beautiful picture of Acer palmatum dissectum group. We'll talk a little more about that as we go on. And I would say this is probably a 50 or 60-year-old tree. Really, really great spread. And as you can see, it's almost a mounding habit. I'd say this tree is probably 10 feet tall, maybe a 20-foot spread. So, and that's often what we think about. This is almost what that stereotypical old Japanese maple look with, a very large canopy and maybe not necessarily a lot of height. So what are we talking about when we talk about a Japanese maple? Japanese is going to be a broad term. As we'll talk about, they have a little bit bigger range than just Japan and the Korean Peninsula, Eastern China as well, Manchuria. There are 4 species we'll really focus on tonight, though, and that's Acer palmatum, which gets the common name of Japanese maple most often. Acer japonicum, which ironically you would think that would be the common name of Japanese maple, but it's typically called a mirror maple. And Acer shirasawanum, which is the full moon maple, which is going to be that really, really rounded leaf. And then also Acer capillipes, which you're not going to see very many of. And we actually won't talk any about their specific species tonight, but snakebark maples have become very popular, I think, the last 15 or 20 years. And you will see them in the trade. And they work very well in the Mid-Atlantic. Here's just again to reiterate and kind of show again the large range. Of course, Japan is what we'll kind of focus on today culturally, but the species itself and the species that the 4 we'll focus on have the wide range here of Eastern China, Korean Peninsula, the entire archipelago of Japan. But on Japan itself, there are actually 23 species of Acer. So, huge, huge diversity in the genus of maple just on those archipelago of islands. And you can see how that would create, a real tradition and centuries of hybridization and selection, really hybridization through selection back then. And also a real cultural reverence for the plant. And it's really true going all the way back to the 8th century. The Heian period, where it was really Kyoto was the new capital of Japan. The capital had been moved there for the first time, and it really was an enlightenment period for the people of Japan. The arts and culture and literature all really went through a boom period for several hundred years, from the 800s all the way through the 1100s. And that created poetry and art that all kind of started to represent what they really started to value in their culture and nature. Both Shintoism and Buddhism had a real reverence for nature and almost a focus on it. So Kyoto had a large diversity of those Acer species we were talking about earlier in the native area there. So as temples started to pop up, they almost popped up specifically for fall foliage, just like we would do here in America. In Japan, it's called Momiji Gari. And you can see on the left, actually, that is the Kiyomizu-dera temple, which is in Kyoto Prefecture. And that viewing platform was built hundreds of years ago. And you can see it's right above the tree line and almost with the specific purpose for taking in foliage as a whole, but I'm sure fall foliage plays a very large part in that as well. As you can see, it's starting to get its real fall colors there. A beautiful, beautiful stretch. And also the Oriasi stream in the Amori Prefecture, as you can see on the right, is just a very natural setting, almost like we would kind of see maybe along the Shenandoah River out in Shenandoah, close to here. But it's, as you can see, just lined with maples. And that's something that in their arts and literature is mentioned going all the way back to the 8th century. And really, it was going all the way through to almost the 16th century of the Muromachi period that you can see some of these arts influences. So on the left here, you'll see it's a ukiyo-e print, which is a wood carving print. And you can see the maple leaves scattered along the ground as the pair walks through the garden or landscape setting of some sort. You can see the fall foliage in the back. That's the red of the maple. And that, that was from much more recently in the 1700s to 1800s. But in the print above from the Heian period, where you see garden workers or perhaps some of the emperor's servants out cleaning up the fall garden, collecting leaves, it's very clear what the artist is representing and the significance of the maple in that art. And then also in poetry as well, which was some of the early literature of Japan that is still around for us to study today. The Manyoshu is poetry that specifically talks about going and taking advantage of fall foliage and nature. The Tale of Genji, also from that same Heian period, the specific references. And then a play from the Muromachi period, which was Momiji Gari, specifically called maple hunting or fall foliage leaf hunting, depending on the translation. So Momiji, we keep saying that, and that is actually the Japanese common word for baby's hand, but it means the common kind of slang term for the tree as well. Common name in Japan, you would say, because it looks like the leaf looks very much like a baby's hand with fingers sprayed out. So they're all kind of 5 to 7 to 9 lobes. So it'd be a weird baby with 7 or 9 fingers, I know. But anyhow, that's one of their common words for is Momiji, where we find Momiji Gari. And, in their historical culture, they've been going back and selecting trees through, both temples and personal gardens at homes and stroll gardens. We'll see some pictures of. And it is a really great thing. Have you seen some of the cultivars that came specifically out of certain areas and regions that certain families started to hybridize those plants? And they continued the trade within the country. It was so well done that they really didn't even get outside of the archipelago. until the very late 1700s. And in that time, it's a very interesting time for the plant trade of the world, actually. There was a gentleman named Carl Thunberg, who was Swedish and a disciple of Carl Linnaeus, who we all know Linnaeus. But Thunberg was a very interesting guy, and after he was done kind of finishing school with Linnaeus, Linnaeus said, you need to go out into the world and start to collect plants and go to some of the places that people haven't really started to get that plant material to us from yet. And first place he went was South Africa to twofold, collect plants and also to learn Dutch, because the only people at the time that were getting into Japan were the Dutch for trade. Japan had a no foreigners policy for hundreds of years. And the first people allowed in were the Dutch for trade, and that's how Thunberg was allowed in. And he started to collect plant material at a very large rate. In fact, he's often called the Linnaeus of Japan, and he wrote the first flora of Japan. And you'll see his name often in the trade. In fact, Pinus thunbergii out of Japan is named after Carl Thunberg. And lots of plants that we don't have time to get into all of his discoveries, but he was actually one of the people that was sending those plant materials, those Acer palmatum, those Acer japonicums, back to the Dutch and back to Amsterdam region and the Dutch East India Trading Company and their greenhouses. And those, from those selections, they started to be distributed to horticulturalists and nurseries and arboretum, actually all over the world. And the Kew got theirs, first one in the early 1820s, first introduced to England as a whole, very, very shortly after that, as most plants that when they first got to the Kew, you know, they were very quick to get them into the industry and the trade. And then we got our first one planted at the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, March 1st, 1880, which I don't want to say definitively that that plant is still growing, but I know that the procedures of the Arnold Arboretum would say that if that plant was in decline, they would have taken cuttings and rooted it and kept that plant material alive in some sense. So I would put some money that there is some living relative of that original planting somewhere on the grounds. And so from that early time, you know, there were over 200 named cultivars. They were very interesting. There were the Yokohama father and son nursery out of Japan that were so popular. They actually had outposts in Paris and London and Hong Kong, I believe. And they're still in business today. And I think they started in business in the late 1890s. Beautiful catalogs from those times. But shortly thereafter, as we all know, World War II struck the world, and Japan was an island nation with a shortage of fuel. And from what I understand, it was not just the Japanese maple industry and nurseries, but it was nurseries across the entire country, camellias and lots and pines and trees that could have possibly been in, you know, the starting stages of training for bonsai, but anything that they could use for firewood, from what I understand and what I've read, was taken, harvested, and lots of cultivars of trees were lost forever. And you know, it was a mandate of the government. And of course, the United States of America had mandates that, you know, we had to grow food in our backyards, and baseball fields had to be planted for food, victory gardens and such. So it was a concept not unknown to the entire world, but sadly, some of the older cultivars are lost forever. But as was the horticultural craze of the 1950s and on, you know, it's well over 1,000 new cultivars, and some of the older cultivars too are now in the trade and are in, you know, a big demand every year. The market continues to grow. I believe the U.S. Agricultural Census of Ornamental Plants put Japanese maple somewhere over like $58 million sold just in 2019. So that's a lot of trees, and the number continues to go up. So there will be more and more cultivars every year. Lots of cool nurseries all along the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast continue to put out new trees every year if you follow Japanese maples at all. And, they really continue to be a symbol of elegance in the garden. And I will say quickly that they really lack problems. The problems typically are root related or problems at installation or planting or being grown in a container with girdling roots or, possibly not enough mulch layer over such a shallow rooted plant. They really lack disease and pest problems in our landscape as a whole. Very, very, very occasionally verticillium wilt becomes a thing, but I've heard maybe one case in the last 5 years of that. So very easy to grow plant. The ability for the plant to adapt to multiple conditions is well quoted. In fact, someone we'll talk about shortly, J.D. Vertrees, often regarded as the best mind for Japanese maples in the West, and in fact wrote the book Japanese Maples, I think published back in 2001. Said and quoted something along the lines of, grown all the way from Washington State to Southern California, all the way across the Midwest of America, and from New England all the way down through the Southeast, this tree seems to thrive in any and all of those conditions. So it's a very popular tree, no matter where you're gardening, and you'll come across it a lot. And the two most common species you're going to come across in nurseries are Acer palmatum and Acer japonicum. Both native to that same range we talked about earlier: Japan, Korea, China, Eastern China, I should say. But here's some of the differences that immediately arise. Is the Acer palmatum is going to have much deeperly lobed leaves. It's going to have that baby hand look that we were talking about earlier. Many hybrids exist for both. Of the thousands cultivar or 1,000 plus cultivars we were talking about earlier, it's fair to say that there's several hundred of each of these, 500 plus of each of these in the trade. So there is one for your garden, and there's going to be a cultivar that has been bred for the texture or color or height, width that you're kind of looking for. And now Acer japonicum, the full moon maple, is going to have that much larger, more rounded leaf, very deeply dissected as well on some of these cultivars we're going to be talking about. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of the classification systems that have been developed. We were just speaking about J.D. Vertrees. He came up with the first of the classification systems for Japanese maples and broke them into 7 categories. Those 7 categories still exist today, but they have been expanded to 17. And they've been expanded to 17 by the Maple Society. They are out of the UK. And they are the group made up of botanists, horticulturalists, Acer enthusiasts as a whole, and experts, and they help register new cultivars. They look at the genetic material and make sure that it is unique. And really, it really taps into expertise of botanists all over the world at arboretums and botanic gardens, and also expert home gardeners as well. So of those 17 groups, we'll go into all of it. And really, they were building with Cor van Gelderen, a noted botanist out of the Netherlands. I'm not sure where he calls home now, actually, for home garden or arboretum or botanic garden, or university perhaps. But he and J.D. Vertrees' work are what really built up these 17 groups. And J.D. Vertrees is actually from America, from Oregon, which is where a lot of maple breeding, Japanese maple breeding, is done. Boring, Oregon, right near Isley Nursery. They do a lot of it. Broken Arrow, in that general area, kind of that eastern central Oregon, about an hour east of Portland. Anyone's ever been out there? Really cool area for growing maples and conifers. So here are the 17 groups we're talking about. And this classification system is really based on leaf lobes, variegation, and color. And bark, I should say, as well. Bark texture is going to play in. And here are all 17, a little overwhelming. Let's talk a little bit quickly about some of these leaf anatomy terms that we're going to be talking about this evening as we're defining these differences. So the lobes are actually like, the projections of the leaf that are, in Japan, when they say baby's hand, they're the fingers of the hand, let's say. The sinus is that gap between those lobes. So depending on which direction you're looking at it from here, most of these sinuses, it looks like an A shape. If you're looking at it from a different direction, it would be a V. The petiole is the connective stalk, little stem that attaches to the leaf to the branch. And the margin, and this leaf, I use this picture specifically. So if you look here, the margin along these edges are red. And that is going to be that outer edge of the leaf. And then the veination is the veins that are going to feed the leaf. And both feed, I should say, both take energy and from the leaf and take nutrients to the leaf. And with some of our variegated leaves, that's the veination is going to play into that. Here's why they are what they are. Arboretum is going to be the most common. The leaves are lobed, about halfway down the blade. It's very, very, very what you would think of when you see just kind of very common Japanese maple. The color is going to be a light green when it emerges, and then the dark green and a shade of medium to dark green in the summer. And they're always going to have 7 lobes. So it's very, very specific. But there are going to be some cultivars that fall in that one that will give some variation in leaf color. Arborteum, this is going to be one of the more desirable in the trade, with that summer foliage is going to be red to purple. We'll talk about one specifically right off the bat. We'll talk about a few tonight. But it is often a specimen plant or a centerpiece plant to give an offset with the other green foliage of a garden. Arboretum is going to be a yellow or orange color to the leaf in the summer. And any of these, I should say right now, when we get to this one, any of these lighter leaf color that are going to be like a yellow or orange or a variegation or some pink to their summer color, just like most Japanese maples of this leaf color, they're going to need some afternoon shade. So very few of those cultivars that we'll talk about, or cultivars within these groups, are going to be able to take full sun all day. We'll talk a little bit more about care as we go on. Corallinum is going to be that, again, a pink color to the leaf in the summer. Almost always the lobe will be only about half the blade of the leaf. Sometimes you'll find, I think a few newer cultivars in the Corallinum are starting to be a little more deeply lobed. Not quite dissectum, but. And then crispum, we'll talk a little bit about this one as well. It's where the leaf margins have a little bit of a wave or curl to them. Dissectum, as we were just talking about in that first picture, was when we're talking about lace leaf maples. A lot of people say lace leaf. Those are actually dissectum maples. And it is those very, very deeply lobed, heavily toothed margins, really beautiful. And again, like that very first picture we started with. Linear lobum, very deeply divided lobes, lightly toothed, almost look like very single individual leaves coming off of a central point. Almost look like they're not connected at all. Matsumore, very wide sinuses and tooth margins, and it's going to be a green summer color. Let's see what else. Marginatum, we were just talking about, where the margin is going to contrast. The margin color will contrast with the center color. Palmatum is a little confusing that it has its own group and it's also a species. But it's really going to be about that brown or green wood in the winter, and the lobes being very shallow. Pine bark, as we said, as one of the definitives. Here's a few for the bark portion of this classification system. Pine bark, very rough bark, almost like persimmon Virginia, or excuse me, Diospyros virginiana persimmon, or native persimmon. Very, almost, I like to call it like an alligator skin bark, that very deeply divided, rough skin bark. There's a cultivar that we won't talk about today. I don't have any pictures, but Nishikigara is a very popular pine bark. Redwood, we'll talk about one very, very effective and very successful cultivar here in the Mid-Atlantic, but this is where the bark will be that coral orange. I very rarely yellow, but a coral orange through the majority of like a spring, summer, and then get a very vibrant red throughout the cold winter months, almost from about October through March, early April. Very, very stunning in the landscape. Reticulatum is where the veins contrast with the rest of the leaf. Variegatum is where the leaf is variegated beyond just the margins. Cessifolium, that's where they lack a petiole. We won't talk about any of those today. Actually, I've actually never grown any in the Cessifolium group personally. And then witch's broom, a little confusing. Witch's broom is often considered a shoot from the parent plant that is unlike the foliage of the parent plant. So it's often taken for a cutting and then propagated as a new cultivar. Lots of conifers are started that way. But here is where the middle lobe is actually going to be shorter than the rest of the lobes. So let's just say for make it easy, 5 lobes, just like a finger, it would be, like that. So not what the typical witch's broom vernacular is in horticulture. All right, so through all of those groups, we now can talk about some of the cultivars that really work well for our Mid-Atlantic area. And right off the bat, as we were talking about, Arborteum is always a very popular group. I get asked very often about, great red foliage, purple foliage, acers, or especially Japanese maples, Acer palmatum and japonicums that will work in the garden for a medium landscape tree. And Bloodgood, it goes back for quite a long time. It came out of the Bloodgood nursery in Long Island, but it's a very reliable tree. There is an issue. Dr. Durr, who wrote the Woody Landscape Manual for Plants, University of Georgia professor, he has noted several times, and I've heard him say it in a talk in person as well, that this one, just trust your nursery, because there's sometimes, this is a grafted tree, so there's sometimes other clones being traded under this name that are not as possibly hardy as Bloodgood is for ours. So, I like to think most of our nurseries around here are pretty reputable, but if you're buying online, that's why I make this note. So many people buy online these days. Just make sure you're buying from a reputable source, because this one has been around so long that people, will call Bloodgood and maybe it's not the right genetics. So anyways, this is one of the most popular. It's like 15 by 20, 15 by 20, great medium landscape tree. And just like I was saying, green or red, purple will take sun all day long, full sun, no problem. But when you start talking about any of the variegated or any of the yellow foliage or pink foliage in summer, that's when we're going to talk about some afternoon shade. This is another japonicum. This is in the Vitifolium. As you can see, this has got a big, huge leaf, just like wine leaf, Vitis vitifolia. This is in the Emoenum group, so kind of one of those general. So like I was saying, that's kind of the catch-all general group, but there's been some real hybridization. So where this has 7 lobes always, but it's a very big 7 lobes with a real full moon appearance when we talk about that full moon maple. And this is in its fall color, because it's going to have a pretty standard medium, light to medium green, very robust color though, these large leaves. But in the fall is where it really puts on its show. This brilliant orangish yellow, and then it'll finish in a brilliant red. Just fire engine red is what I would call it. Such a great plant that the Royal Horticultural Society gave it its award of garden merit, which I still think is pretty top notch in the plant world. If they they've done a lot of growing and testing to give these garden merit awards out, so I think it's worth a mention typically. And then if you're into the botanical interest of maples, which I am, I think their flowers are, they're very dainty and inconspicuous, but they are on this plant a little early. They'll be before April 1st, maybe the second, third week of March, and they've got a little bit of a white They've got some white bracts on them, or I shouldn't say bract, excuse me, white petal to them as well. Those very thin petals that are maple flowers. But if you're someone that likes to get out early and see what's blooming, you know, before everything else, I mean, it doesn't even take a hand lens with this plant because it grows at a great height and spread. So it's a very reachable plant. It's going to be, again, a medium 10 by 12. And really for width, I would say more 8 by 10. But, you know, you look at a lot of the references and it's going to say evenly 10, 12, 10, 12. This is palmatum. So back to a palmatum. And this is in the Aureum group. This is, in my opinion, the most reliable of the yellow foliage Acer palmatums or japonicums for a full sun location. It's pretty reliable if it's going to have 6+ hours of sun in a day. And it is a brilliant yellow. It's really going to kind of come out a yellowish orange in the spring. It's going to have some pink and red tints to some of the leaves in the summer, actually, especially in full sun. And then the sun, or excuse me, then in the fall is when it's going to go to like it's going to really accentuate some more of that pink that was really an undertone in the summer and go to a red, or excuse me, an orange.
Yeah, speaking.
Scarlet red, I'm sorry. Okay. And again, this is one of the more heat tolerant in the group as well. And it's going to be more upright than wide with maybe a 12-foot maximum height and a 8-foot, possibly 10-foot spread at 10 to 15 years in the garden. And the bark, I will say on this one, has also got almost a light green to brown tint as well. Not sure, someone's not muted and I'm getting someone talking in the background. If you don't mind checking your mics. Thank you.
Probably the smallest.
Steve Branch, you're not muted if you don't mind. Thank you. All right, so the next one is a Shirasawanum. So Golden Moon, while we're staying on the yellow foliage Aureum group. And this is going to be a big, large leaf again, where we're talking probably 11 to 12 lobes on some of the leaves, really, really robust and extra full moon, if you want to say, since actually Japonicum is often a full moon looking leaf as well. So here we have almost a spherical look to this plant in the picture, but really it's going to get a good amount of height to it. 12 feet is the one that we have growing at the Arboretum, 12 by about 8, and I think it's 20 years old or so. But that we have this one growing in a location where it gets some protection from the afternoon sun, and it's going to need it actually, because we lost a tree near it a few years ago, and it really started to get some sunburn on the leaves quickly. So this is another one actually that's going to have a couple of trade names which I'd make a note of. You might see this one as just Aureum, and that is sometimes true of these groups and categories. You'll see it as maybe just an Aureum, and another nursery will have it as Golden Moon, but it will typically be the same plant. They're just some nurseries label under these categories themselves when they see it as a category on the listings. And this one is a real, I will say, I've seen this in a lot of botanic gardens as I go around and visit other places and you know, on work trips and on personal trips. I've seen it used. This is actually a picture that I took, and I believe this was Isley, but it might have been at Broken Arrow's show garden, but it was definitely out in Oregon in one of the growers' show gardens. And I just loved the colors and textures they had. They had another, you can see Arborteum group maple growing back there behind it. And I believe a Thuya there on the right. I can't remember the cultivar, but anyhow, it's a very reliable tree. Very, very reliable if you're looking for somewhere for a shady afternoon spot with to brighten it up with that bright gold leaf. Here we get back to a purple or red leaf, but actually it is going to be in the Dissectum group. This is Acer palmatum Crimson Queen. And this is a very representative photo of the tree. It's going to have that wide mounding habit you know, a little kid could hide under there and have like his own little fort or a little make-believe world. It's going to have that very, very, very pendulous out-facing habit where, you know, if you really like pruning, you can kind of pick some holes to open up to see some of that branch architecture with a tree like this, which is I like a lot. Again, dissectum group, so you can see in these leaves, you can see why people call them lace leaves, very heavily lobed, very heavily toothed margins, and it's going to emerge. This whole, really the whole year of this tree is going to be a red to purple. It's going to emerge with the same bright crimson that it almost finishes the year with the bright scarlet, but it will really go to that crimson again and fall before scarlet. And then it's a burgundy. This is its summer color here. And again, this is probably one of the most reliable and one of the best lace leaf deep red, you know, of the dissectum group types for this mid-Atlantic area. You know, this is a tree that's gonna, with the proper mulch layer, it's not gonna overly stress in our hot summer, and it's also gonna be able to take, you know, what is now becoming our occasional cold winter after what, 2 8B winters in a row. But you know, I make a note at the bottom here that this can be a very dramatic plant. A very good friend of mine has this same plant, Crimson Queen, growing over the edge of a wall where he has a waterfall coming down into a pond on the other side, and it cascades beautifully. And I've seen a lot of other examples of Crimson Queen and other of this same mounding style Acer palmatum being used very effectively on an elevated space and being allowed to really cascade or just kind of gently fall into the space below. It'll take some pruning to get it perfect, of course. That's how it always works. Here's another palmatum. This is Trompenberg. This is another one that is going to be on the bigger side as far as height. It's going to be a little more upright than of that mounding shape we were just talking about. So, you know, I've seen this plant personally at 20, not quite 25 feet. And it was probably 12 feet wide. So very, you know, an excellent, you know, what we would call a decurrent shape. Hardier than a lot of the varieties that are in this purple red 6 lobe with the convex curl. A lot of these are not going to be very favorable to how warm it gets in our summers and how cold it gets in our winters, believe it or not. So it actually, it does a little bit better a little further north. It gets stressed out in our summer and then it really can't protect itself for winter. It's better off if it has just the cold temperatures to deal with. So it is still a recommendation if you're looking for a convexum group. The rest of the convexum groups really are just not as reliable. But some people really want this downward shaped leaf for a texture, a specific texture in the garden. This is another one that the Royal Horticultural Society sees fit to give the award of garden merit to. In the right application, it's very, very, very hardy and appropriate for that convex look in a red purple. And it came out of the Trompenberg Arboretum in Rotterdam, which, as we all know, they have a strong horticultural background in the Netherlands, so they do a lot of breeding there. But they received it as a seedling. So here's one that is going to definitely require some afternoon shade. This is in the Corallinum group, so that spring foliage is going to be pink, but really it's going to remain like an almost amber color in summer. It's a very, it's a smaller plant, really. When I say 8 to 10 feet, that's, you know, that's a 10 to 15 year in the garden size. You're going to buy this plant at, you know, probably 3 or 4 feet tall. So a lot of people, I've seen a lot of really fine horticulturalists use this as a height in a container. You know, the thriller, if you will. So it has a great low canopy that, you know, is going to allow some underplanting in that type of situation. And then, you know, it could be transplanted to the garden after a couple of years in the container. And after it's got a nice big root system, and you could probably push it to how much afternoon shade it got after it was bulked up a bit. This is one we grow in the Asian collection, the Kawa Yatsubusa. This is another Acer palmatum. This is going to be the only one in the crispum group we'll talk about today. And that's the wavy curly leaf margins. And this plant really kind of shingles its leaves, as you can see in this photo here. For those of you that were on the tour, we saw this one. It was up the stairs near the parking area. And this is going to be the dwarfest of the trees we talk about this evening. 5-6 feet is generous. The one that we've had in the garden for about almost 25 years is barely 4 feet tall. But it's about 3 feet wide as well. So very spherical. This is a very representative photo of the tree. But just you can lose perspective in this sense that this tree is probably only 3 or 4 feet tall. Really, I should have taken a photo actually today. Just today, the one in the garden started to get some red to it. Our fall foliage is so late this year in some regards. But it really has a brilliant red, almost like that fire engine red I mentioned earlier. And it really holds its leaves for several days longer, as it has this kind of shingled leaf growth habit. So it keeps some color for, maybe a week longer than the other acers in the collection. So it's really beautiful and really vibrant in the summer as well with that texture. We grow ours in the sea of Ophiopogon mondo grass. And it's I think it's striking. It's a real eye catcher and very reliable for our area. This and the one in our garden has been there 25 years, so it's lived through Snowmageddon and Snowpocalypse and all that stuff we had in the last 20 years here. And it took it like a tank. So this is the only weeping the Acer japonicum or Acer palmatum. Really, this is the only really reliable one in the dissectum group. And I think that in the dissectum group, this is really where you get a lot of effect from the weeping. There are a lot of weeping Japanese maples and lots that work, and there won't be any problem finding one at a nursery in this area. But this is a unique one, Green Cascade. It's going to be a little wider than it is tall, and you're really going to get with the proper pruning, you really get that waterfall pendulous look from it. Very deep green. This is its spring color. You see here leafing out in almost that light green chartreuse. And then it goes to a deeper green in summer, and then another like brilliant yellowish orange to a very rich, almost crimsony red to finish. And very finely dissected, heavily toothed margins with anywhere from 9 to 11. Very, very lacy look for the dissectum group. Very cool tree. I've seen it. An old neighbor had one that was probably 15 years old, and it was absolutely stunning. Worth every year of pruning that he put into it. Maybe not a lot, maybe a couple hours every year. Here's one of my favorite foliages. We grow this at a couple of places in the Arboretum. It's growing in the bonsai collection as an actual tree, not a bonsai, and it's growing in the Asian collection as well. This is Aconita folium. I really like the Japanese name for it, which is Maikujaku, and I'm sure I butchered that, which means dancing peacock, which I think is much more creative name. But you can really see it's got that almost fern-like foliage of monkshood, which is aconitum. That's what Aconita folium comes from. Latin would be foliage like an aconitum. And you can see really in this picture, I use this picture specifically because you can see the foliage pretty well as it's going from its as it's summer to its fall yellow and reds. But you can see how as the lobes extend, the toothing on them is very unique. And the lobes are divided all the way down to the petiole. The sinuses are extremely deep and wide. It's, you could almost fool someone at first glance or two that it's not a maple. Cool plant, not easy to find these days. I searched all of these just before the talk again. I gave the talk a month ago or so. And, you can find it and online in local-ish nurseries. This is one I couldn't find recently. So I could find it online, I will say that. but I always hesitate to recommend buying plants online because not everyone is honest online. Here is where we will get to the red bark group. Again, back to one of the bark differences in the categories. And this is, I grew this plant at Smithsonian Gardens in the Enid A. Haupt Garden, and we used it as a container plant specifically. We had 3 of them, and we would move them around for effect in the winter. And they come out with an absolutely fabulously light green and yellowish color in the spring. You can see on the right, it's still kind of got that deep red from the winter. It's emergent foliage against that. Very, very beautiful contrast. And again, it goes through that bright yellowish green. It gets a little more of a deeper green for the summer. It could take full sun for sure. And then it will drop its leaves. Not really a lot of color, honestly. It goes to like yellowish orange. But really, as the weather gets colder, that bark, as you see on the left, just starts to glow. It just really starts to intensify in that red color. It's really effective in the winter months. And we would put them out in front of the castle doors just to give a little pop of color, stick some conifers right behind them. I like what they've done with this container here on the left, which is, it looks like a sedum of some sort, but it's going to give a real contrast to those winter months. Really effective plant, all 4 seasons. And here's the only one we'll talk about from the variegated group, because it's not planted in the right place. They're going to burn, and they're going to get sun scorch. They might only want 4 hours of morning sun. But this is a really cool one, Yukigumo, which you'll often see this sold under floating clouds, cultivar named floating clouds in the West. 15 by 12. So again, more of that decurrent shape, more of that upright growth habit. And you can see it'll emerge with that pastel green and pink you see on the right in the spring. And it's an incredible plant to watch leaf out. And then it goes to that on the left, I should say, to that almost spotty, splashy white and green. And if you have that perfect place in the garden, and I should say that all of these plants are really adaptable to soil conditions, but what they love is the same conditions for like azaleas and rhododendrons, acidic, loamy. And yeah, if you have that perfect spot in the garden that gets like 4 hours of nice filtered sun every day, this is the perfect plant for it. And it's also perfect for containers. And that's the way to really get the most out of this plant if you don't have that perfect spot in the garden. But you can have a perfect spot on a patio in a pot. Great container plant. And again, it's going to have a really beautiful range of shades of like apricot to fiery red in the fall as well. So very much a 3-season plant. So as we talked about earlier, with planting and care, it's really what separates success and not with this genus, or excuse me, with this specific 2 species, kind of Acer palmatum, Acer japonicum, Acer shirasuanum as well. It's really going to be, a lot of them are container grown, and girdling roots and kinked roots. A lot of that is going to be where the issues come in. So when you're going to get these trees from the nursery, you're going to really have to do some inspection on that root system. I'm not shy to pull a plant out of its pot. I'm not going to make a big mess, but I'm going to make sure there's no girdling roots and that there's no really large central kinked roots growing back into the root ball. And that's what's important for a tree that you want to last for the next 50 or 60 years. So do some work, because a lot of these get grown in containers. If you are going to do a bare root or ball and burlap, obviously, I know this is a reputable garden club, but obviously those trees need to be planted in the dormant season, and they'll be harvested in that same dormant season. So it's a very limited window of opportunity. So a lot less trees get planted that way these days, sadly, and a lot more container trees get planted because they're just available all year, and you can pop them in whenever you want. So just be very mindful of that. And again, just put a lot of inspection into the root and trunk. If it's a grafted species, you'll be able to see it in the growth habit there, and just make sure it's got a healthy graft and the roots look good. But most of the ones I recommended tonight are not grafted. So And again, as I mentioned several times tonight, the green forms and the red forms can tolerate much more sun, and then any of the lighter, lighter shade leaves are really going to require some afternoon shade. As we talked about for the soil conditions, really, think what's best for rhododendrons and azaleas, and that's what the perfect conditions are for these trees. But again, very adaptable. So don't be scared to plant them if you have heavy clay like me. They'll do well, and don't worry about going overboard with amending soil. I say that often to people. Let it grow into the native soil that's going to be around. You're not going to be able to amend enough of your yard for the root mass that will grow from this tree in the next 30 years. So don't bother, just dig the proper size hole. We'll talk about that here in a moment. And if you're going to amend, just work a little bit of compost into the backfill and then spread a small layer of compost over the planting. But definitely make sure we're mulching. You definitely want to have a 3-inch-ish layer mulch, but keep that mulch 2 inches away from the trunk to create, so that we're not creating a zone that where adventitious roots can then come in and undo all the good work you did by fixing any girdling roots that may have existed earlier. They may create another girdling root situation. So yeah, this is a very shallow and finely rooted tree. So severe drought can kill the tree, but I mean severe drought. If it's established already, the tree will probably be okay. You won't need to water it. But, again, a severe drought, you might want to give it a drink middle of August. We haven't had rain for 4 weeks or something. It could probably do with a drink. And then a mulch layer will protect it in the winter. And just because I'm an ISA certified arborist and I talk so much about just the proper installation of trees will go so far in the success of your tree, and that goes for any genus we're going to talk about, but Japanese maples definitely as well. So here's the do's and don'ts, but really, let's not worry about any of the pruning or any of that stuff up top. I'm sure you guys understand to prune out rubbing branches or co-dominant leaders or anything that has too narrow of a crotch early on. So we'll call that nursery pruning. But really, when you're planting it, let's just make sure we're planting it high. You want to make sure that root flare is exposed, and that you're clearing away any soil and cutting away any adventitious roots which have started to grow above that root flare, cleaning that all up, and then planting it proud is what I think they're calling it now in the industry. But so that's maybe an inch or two above grade. So as that tree settles, it's not gonna that root flare is not going to get below grade and then start to possibly get adventitious roots, what could be a downfall 20 years down the road. And again, just make sure that, unamended backfill, you really don't need to mix in any compost, but if you're going to less than 10%, you can put a little bit on top, but again, don't bury the root flare. And then when we're talking about, burlap or the wire basket, try to get as much of it off as you can, but they've done a bunch of studies recently and it actually doesn't affect it at all if you don't get it all off. As long as it's not girdling any roots and you clipped it along around, it's going to be okay. So thank you so much. That is the end of it. Here's a few of the works that were cited. When I talk about any of the disease stuff, maybe you guys have heard from Dave Clement out of the University of Maryland Extension, very knowledgeable gentleman. Had the good fortune to be a colleague of his for many years, but he wrote a great paper. It's online. I think it's in Maryland Grows, which is part of their extension stuff. And it's Japanese maples in Maryland, which is talks just specifically about some of the disease and pests. But he kind of reiterates that a lot of it's a root and planting issues. So if you can address that. Dr. Durr, I mentioned briefly, North Carolina State Extension for some of the facts on a few of these cultivars, and Isley Nursery as well, just to get some decent pictures for a few of the cultivars. And then again, J.D. Bertrees, Japanese Maples, that book is, I think I saw it online used for like $12, but it usually goes in hardback for, 25 or something, but it is great. He knows his stuff. And it goes over a lot of the breeding and cultivars, and then a lot of the history that we've touched on briefly too. So Thank you all so very, very much. And I'm open for any questions you guys might have.
Matt, this is Olivia. This has been incredibly informative. This is just a wealth of knowledge that's almost overwhelming. There have been several questions that have come in through the chat. Would you like me to read those to you, or can you read those yourself? Which would you prefer?
Let me just grab chat here. All right. I'm happy to read them.
Okay, whatever works best for
The
you.
dancing peacock, so the aconitifolium, could it work in a container? Absolutely. So what I should have also said when I mentioned that some of those work well in containers is that any Japanese maple works well in a container. In fact, lots of, I'm going to use just a couple of references. I've seen a lot of art museums use them in large containers in front of entrances. And I've seen lots of applications. In fact, I've seen very large dissectum Japanese maples out in front of the National Gallery of Art. I'm not sure if those go in and out or where they move those, but I've seen a good size representation of that. And so anyhow, that just goes to say any of those groups, any of those, the two species could definitely be grown in a container. Sally, does the new growth tend to be more red than the older bark? And if you're referring to the Sangukaku or any of those, the red bark group,
Yep.
it is, yes, I will say yes. It is going to be the most vivid of the red. And as the bark starts to expand and get a little older, it will dull, but it will definitely still hold the red color. It was not going to go green or fully brown ever. At the very, very base, you might start to see it go a little brown, maybe that bottom 1 foot. But the specimens that I had grown were, at least I grew them for over 7 years, and I never noticed such a lack in the older bark that it was unbecoming or noticeably not red. So, but you're right. The newer growth definitely is the most brilliant. And Brian, the Yukigomo, excuse me, varies by year and by conditions. How does this work? Well, it is a little bit of, I should say conditions really is going to be how much shade sun. So that is just the plant's response to how much of that lack of chlorophyll or pigment it's able to express. Some plants express the variegation or coloration of their leaves more with more sun. Some need more shade in order to express it. And typically in Japanese maples, the more shade is where those variegated and where any of those softer color leaves are going to be expressed more fully, because they're going to get a scorch and it's going to take away and those others. Now varies by year. That's interesting. Of course, every year's growth is going to be a little bit of a new genetic roll of the dice. So the plant's variegation could express itself a little differently. But I don't know anything about it being like a specific annual pattern to that difference. It's kind of just because every year plants resplice their genes to grow their new growth. So you'll get a little bit of differentiation, which is why variegation works a little differently on every leaf. I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to open up the mic if that didn't address it, or type whatever works easiest. Do I mulch containers? Absolutely. I do mulch containers. And again, just want to keep it away from the base of the trunk. Give it an inch or so. Of course, it's going to get close to the trunk. It'll get knocked around, and occasionally just kind of shuffle it away. And if you see any little adventitious roots growing, just kind of knock them off with your finger or tip of a pruner or something. But yeah, it's because in a container, I'll just expand on it shortly. In a container, it's of course going to be getting colder from all of the other sides as well. What's a good analogy? Like bridge freezes before road, right? There's cold air on both sides of the bridge instead of the road where it's just one. Same kind of thing with a pot, right? Cold air on all sides. So that root ball isn't going to be getting the greenhouse effect of the earth as if it was dug into the earth. So I would say anything that you're gonna let stay outside all winter, it's probably best to have it maybe not a lot of extra room in a pot where you'll get root rot, but maybe one size bigger, give it a little insulation. And then, maybe a 2-inch layer of mulch to help insulate that fine, shallow root layer of a Japanese maple. So you might want to go again with a shallower pot as well to prevent root rot with some of these wider but shallower. Why is it important to remove tags and labels? It's because those will, well, not all, some are made of a, excuse me, easier to break material for the tree than others, but some are of a really tough plastic or sometimes even like a metal twisty that will girdle a branch and kill it. And I've seen it actually grow into the main stem of a tree and kill the tree as well by cutting off xylem and phloem, both actually, by having that metal band go into it. And that's because it was put on at a young age and it grew up and it kind of grew right into the middle of the tree. And it was a slow death, of course. It wasn't right away. But it'll happen to us all the time at the Arboretum. If you looked at any botanic garden Arboretum that has metal hanging record tags or even the display labels, which are bigger, those typically are on a metal twist, kind of a plastic covered or coated twist. And trees grow fast and we don't always get to them for inventory every couple of years. And sometimes branches expand quickly and it'll grow right into that branch and you'll have to cut it out with your pruners. Because if it grows all the way into it, more than likely it's gonna girdle that branch and the branch is gonna drop. Losing one branch in a tree is the end of the world, but I've seen it kill small trees. And not to say that will happen from your nursery tags. A lot of your nursery tags are just plastic and string or paper, and that stuff will probably just fall off on its own from the weather or the tree growing. But better safe than sorry, especially for a tree to spend a few $100 on. Where would you recommend buying some of these varieties? So unfortunately, I work for the US government and I cannot recommend any of those. So I would recommend a few things in my nurseries though. Instead of a specific nursery, I would recommend asking where they source their plants from. They shouldn't have any problem telling you, like in this specific tree, hey, where did you source this from? Because they're not growing them 9 times out of 10. These larger trees are being sourced typically from out west, especially with Japanese maples, North Carolina. And I know of a big grower in New Jersey too, Western New Jersey, but yeah, ask them. And if they don't mind telling you, then look up that place and they'll probably have a website and you can see, their history or whatever. You can do a little research on your own is all I'm saying about the nursery. And that's a good way to, you can ask also what their IPM standards are, stuff like that. But if you've been doing business with a place a long time, ask them for the cultivar you want. They'll probably order it for you if they don't have it. That way you can stick with someone you trust already. And again, and I hate to recommend the internet, but check it out on the internet first. There might be a nursery you can drive to that says they have it. Have some pictures on your phone ready to double check and stuff. Okay, so Elizabeth Grinchfeld. Excuse me if I mispronounced that. I have a butterfly. Acer butterfly, which has been, in present location for about 15 years. How successful will it be to relocate it to more shade? Oh, so they're easily transplanted, I will say. Now, I say easily, by the tree will take it. I don't know how easy it will be for you to dig it and ball and burlap it, because that is a bit of a lost art. And I will say I have hand dug a few trees in my day. I luckily never worked at a nursery that grew or a tree farm, had to do this every day, because it is a grueling task where you're just really digging in all the way around just a little bit at a time, and you're setting it perfectly to be able to come back in and wrap it and pin it. And there's guys that work at tree farms that do just that. So You can hire someone, it'd be pretty expensive. I won't lie to you. Someone's gonna charge you a pretty penny for that kind of labor. But if it's doing, well, I don't, it just says it's been in the present location for 15 years. I don't know if it's in decline and you think that maybe moving into shade will help. Here is another situation where you might consider, and this is just me spitballing, but you could plant a tree next to it, a shade tree. I don't know what your garden situation is, but instead of moving it, you could give it some shade. But I'm happy to talk about that a little more too, if you like. But you would have to ball and burlap. At 15 years, I'm guessing that's a big root ball. It'll take some work. So, Atalanta Ray, how much morning sun do the variegated varieties need? I would say in an ideal world, 4 to 6 hours is about perfect. 4 being at about a minimum. Anything under 4, and you're really talking no longer partial sun. You're talking more light shade, almost full shade. Yeah.
These are really helpful information, and I so appreciate your coming and talking to us tonight
It is very much my pleasure.
about sourcing some of these trees. And we have a recommendation that I know you can't make as a government employee, but that Susanna Farm Nursery in Boyd's, Maryland specializes in maples and conifers and might be a really good place to go. Brent is the name of the owner and is extremely knowledgeable. So thank you for the person who offered that information about Susanna Farm Nursery in Boyd's for sourcing some of these trees. And then I see one more follow-up question from Warren about your travels.
Yeah, so I have been to Japan, but not in a professional horticultural sense. Actually, I came to horticulture in a circuitous route. I actually was the general manager at a restaurant, the Watergate, for a number of years, and went for more of a food, and the owner of the restaurant, the Watergate, owned a place in Tokyo. So we were going there to do some training with that restaurant group. And yeah, so I was there in year 2000, and I got into horticulture. I changed, my original degree is in business. Then I went back to school in 2001 and started working in 2004 in the industry. So I went to Japan, but I had no eyes for plants at the time. So it's almost embarrassing that I didn't get to take advantage. It's a good reason to go back as soon as COVID is done with us. I think that was just a comment, or was that another question? Sally, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for coming to listen. And again, I know I gave a tour recently to the Beltsville Garden Club, but if that's something that anyone that missed out would like to set up through your club's leadership, you've got my email. So send me some dates. I'd be happy.